And it's interesting because Luke has 3 other words he could choose to put on the lips of Jesus for poor, but he doesn't choose those. He deliberately chooses the most powerful, the most political, the biggest bombshell that could have been dropped in the middle of Roman domination. And that is that the very people that you have used your governmental power to exploit now have the assistance of a higher authority. Huh? He says, the Spirit of God is upon me. And when the Spirit of God is upon me, he chooses people to be dissenters. He chooses people to give good news to the poor over against the bad news of domination. Moral dissent, my friends, is not just the call of the psalmist, nor is it just the stance of Jesus 2,000 years ago. Moral dissent, it has been and still is our calling today. For all the fighting that we have done over education in the South, my heart hurts when I look over there at my left and that woman that sat on that piano. I remember that she made a decision, her and my father, to come back to the South, to integrate public schools that 17 years after Brown had still not complied with the law. So my mother over there, who was way up in government in the Midwest and one of the best in her field, and my father with his 2 master's degrees, had to come back to the South where he didn't even have protected voting rights. And they had to bring their only child at that time. And without asking my permission, I guess, they entered me into segregated public schools so that they could make their contribution to this legacy of dissent against the evils of segregation and discrimination. That's where my introduction to movement was born. It was born being placed as one of the sacrificial lambs. My mother going to a school where her first name was nigger. But then being able to look at her sitting over there now where she will go to that same school tomorrow morning where the children of the children that called her the N-word now call her Mama Barber. And that's why for me and for you, it is so offensive, it's so immoral, it's so extreme, it's so wrong that people would attempt today, 50 years later, to use their power to destroy and dismantle public education and hand them over to private companies after we have fought so hard and bled so much and stood so long to do better. Somebody must raise a dissent. There was one vote of moral constitutional dissent in the case Plessy versus Ferguson, just one. Justin John Holland from Kentucky, the great dissenter, they called him. And he said that in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. Our Constitution neither knows nor tolerates classes among its citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. He lost the vote, but he won history. He engaged in a one-vote moral dissent, and it was upon this dissent that Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall were able to build the legal theory that led us to the victory against Plessy versus Ferguson in 1954. Just this past week, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg became the voice of moral and constitutional dissent when she said throwing out preclearance, when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes, is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. But then she also reminded the court of Bloody Sunday. How dare her? She brought Bloody Sunday into her dissent. She talked about Dr. King in her dissent when he said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. In other words, she was signaling that one day these justices' decision will be exposed for what it is. What manner of Christian takes away health care for their elders, their brothers and sisters, their neighbors, their family, and their children simply because they don't like an African American leader? What manner of Christian punishes 7- and 8-year-old children by taking their teacher's aid from them? What manner of Christian dares call themselves moral, who will increase the tax burden of the poor and the middle class while lowering it on the wealthy at a time when wealth in our nation is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands? It's happening in North Carolina, but it's bigger than North Carolina. It's a necessity for the destiny of our democracy that we realize that we have to look at public policy through the moral lens of justice for all and through the constitutional principle of the common good. Keeping hundreds of thousands of children from seeing a doctor when they're sick is not just bad policy, it's immoral. That kicking hard-working people who lost jobs through no fault of their own off unemployment benefits to give tax cuts to the very wealthy is not just bad policy or Republican policy or Democrat policy. It's immoral, it's against the common good, and the people must raise a dissent. It has nothing to do with whether or not we have the votes. It doesn't even have anything to do with if they change. They may change, but we must, for God's sake, make sure that there is not a silence, that change ought to be and change ought to happen. We must raise our moral dissent because it is our calling. If you've ever wondered why you were born for this season. If you've ever struggled with why am I here? You are here for this season. If you've ever wrestled with why has God given me the opportunity and the intellect and the ability to go to places that I go, it is for this moment to stand up and raise a moral dissent against the forces of injustice. It's our time. Others have stood, but it's our time now.